stand just for your
Oh,
computer.
perfect.
And you guys have extended workspace. You can spread out. Yeah, see, that's right. Okay. All right, so while this thing is deciding whether it wants to come up today or not, let's just start with a little refresher of what we talked about last time. And once things come up, we'll do our customary logic puzzle and all that other stuff, right? So recall that last time we discussed the sort of present value, future value framework, right? The idea of exponential growth and compound interest, and our workhorse equation was that we're going to start with some amount, it's going to grow at R percentage rate for t periods, and we'll end up with some future amount, right? And we worked it backwards and forwards and sideways, right? We can solve for any of the missing values as long as we know the other three, right? So just to make sure you guys remember what we're doing and sort of think on your feet, let me give you a practice problem. And it'll be pretty short. Let's say we are starting with 30 bucks. Let's say we're waiting until it gets to 1,000 bucks. And let's say that we are going to wait for 40 years. And you want to know what is the interest rate that you must earn in the meantime in order for you to achieve 1,000 bucks in 40 years. Go. And just for practice, just think what might that interest rate be, and then compare it with what you actually get. You want to start training your intuition on these things so that if you need to estimate without having any calculating machines on hand, you can make a more or less reasonable, get a reasonable idea just by thinking about it. All right, so are we ready? Would anyone like to venture out an interest rate?
Yeah. I got 9.2%.
Everybody? 9.2? All right. So how did we find that? You read that result for R, right? Or maybe you happen to have that notes from last time. Right? So just recall that we'll divide by PV, power 0.2 minus 1, there's our rate. And of course, you know, if you're uncertain, just put it back in there and see if you get $1,000 from there, right? So again, you know, not so bad for, you know, at an average rate of 9.2%, $30 turns into about 1,000. Pretty spiffy, right? 40 years. Okay. All right, so now let's come back to our puzzle. This was our previous problem. What do you guys think? Would anyone like to suggest a solution? Yes.
B is a knave and C is a knight.
Okay, why is that?
Because if A actually said that there was only one knight among them, then by B telling the truth, there would be two among them. So that means that B had to be lying and that C is telling the truth.
Well, what if A actually said there is one knight among us, but he was lying? And then B said that he actually said that, but he did. You know, when B says this is what he said, he makes no claim about the truthfulness of what he said. He just says this is what he said. So how about the other half of it?
If A was lying when he said that, and A was telling the truth, all right. If A said that there's only one among them and he was lying, that means that there's two among them, or none among them. And if B said what A said, he's telling the truth. And that means that there is one among them. And C would be lying by saying that he's lying. So that means that if there's only one among them and A was lying by saying there's one, then it's actually telling the truth, because there is only one.
All right. So everybody with us? You guys follow that? Maybe? No? Yes? Guys in this classroom today? All right, so it is indeed the case that B is lying and C is telling the truth, right? Now let's just think about it. First of all, B and C are disagreeing, right? So B says one thing and C says don't believe him. So that tells us that they are of different types, because two knights are always going to agree with each other. You know, one was going to say something true and the other one will say yes, that is true, right? Two knaves will also always agree with each other, because one will say some lie and the other one will lie and say yes, that is true, right? So the only way two people are going to disagree is if they are of different types. So we know that among B and C, one of them is a knight and one of them is a knave. We just don't know which one, right? So now let's see what A can say, right? So let's say A is a knight, so he tells the truth, right? So imagine, you know, if he says there is one knight among us, and it is true. Well, that means he is a knight, and either B or C is also a knight. So there are actually two knights. So that means if he is a knight, he cannot possibly say there is one knight among us, because it would be false, right? Because it would be him plus one of the other guys, right? Now, if A is a knave, he will say, you know, there is a, right? He will say there is one knight among us, and he would be the knave, and then one of the other two guys will be the knight, and it would be true. But he is a knave, and he cannot tell, you know, say truth, right? So whether he's a knight or he's a knave, he could not possibly say there is one knight among us, right? Because when he's a knight, it would be false, and if he's a knave, it would be true, right? So regardless of what the other guys are, we know that no matter what, A couldn't have said that, right? He couldn't have said there is one knight among us. So that means that B must be lying when he says that A said it, right? Because he couldn't have said it no matter what he is. And therefore, when C says that B is lying, C is telling the truth. Right? Now, bonus question, what do you think A is? Why is that?
Because C is denying the fact that there's one in the group. So there must be lesser one than one.
Now be careful, C is denying the fact that A said that there is one in the group. He's not denying the fact that there is indeed one in the group.
Yes, but he's basing that claim saying that he's lying off of the evidence provided. Since if he knew he was lying, he must know that there isn't just one in the group.
Well, couldn't he be, when B says that, A said there is one knight, and C says that's not true, all he's saying is that A didn't say there is one knight. Right?
Probably the reason for that.
Well, what is the reason? If A was a knight, what would he have said?
He would have said that there are two.
Okay, and if A was a knave, what would he have said?
He would have said something
Like 3 or 4
yeah.
or 100, right? So we don't know what A is, right? He could be a knight, in which case he would have said 2, or he could be a knave, in which case he would have said anything other than 1 or 2, right? But we don't know what he is. Right? So there's a reason the problem is asking us for B and C and not for A, because given the parameters of the problem, we actually cannot tell what A is. Right? Now we know that no matter what he is, he couldn't have said 1, but we don't know what he actually said. Right? He has a multitude of possibilities that he could have said. Right? Okay? Makes sense? Are you buying that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So now let's continue in a similar vein, and let's mine this framework of knights and knaves for another problem. See what we can come up with. All ready? Okay. All right, we'll discuss it next time as usual. Now let's move along with our discussion of returns and things. Okay, so we discussed the single sum present value, future value problem, right? We talked about it from the point of view of figuring out how much money we will get in the future. We discussed it also from the point of view of how to find how much we're willing to pay for the right to receive some amount of cash flows in the future, right? And the idea is that we'll compare what is the next best rate of return we can get somewhere else, right? And then use that to find how much we would invest today to get that at that rate. And it wouldn't pay any more, because why would we invest in something that gives us a lower rate of return than something else, right? If we have the choice. So that's the, sort of the idea of the present value problem. So now let's try to extend this to multiple cash flows. So for example, we can say, all right, let's imagine that we're talking about some kind of an investment or some kind of proposition that promises to pay us, let's say $100 in 1 year, right? So with our timeline, time zero is today, by convention, time 1 year, time 2 years, right? And so for example, we say, all right, given the sort of my estimated riskiness of this proposition, I know that elsewhere out there in the market, I could get 5% rate of return, right? And so you would say, okay, what is the maximum I would be willing to pay for this particular promise to receive $100 in 1 year? What would you say? I mean, roughly, it doesn't have to be accurate. Just about 95 bucks, right? So, just a little bit more, because 5% of 95 is less than 95 bucks, right? But somewhere about 95 bucks, a little bit more, because that would produce a 5% rate of return, right? So you say, okay, I'm going to pay about 95.x, something to that effect, right? And you would, why? You would never pay more, because if you pay, say, $96, then your rate of return on that is going to be less than 5%. Right? Somewhere around 4, right? And why would you do that when you can just go somewhere else and get 5? Right? You wouldn't want to. So, so that's the maximum you would be willing to pay. And so in the competitive market, presumably, the price you bid up is just about where it is equalized with other similar investments, right? So now the next question is, let's imagine somebody promises to give you $100 in 2 years. And let's imagine again that we're looking at it and we're saying, okay, other similar investments of similar riskiness, I can get 5% per year rate of return on this. And you would say, how much am I willing to pay for this promise to get $100 in 2 years? So roughly, what do you think? Or maybe not so roughly, if you could actually Anyone? Any suggestions? I'll take it. About 90, right? It'll be slightly more than 90, right? Because we get 5% on 90, it would be less than $5, right? So when we get another 5%, it'll be again less than $5. So it would be actually slightly more than 90, but it would be roughly, 90 point something dollars, maybe 91. All right, so if we want to find it exactly, of course, right? We set up our present value, future value framework. We say some amount growing at 1.05 at 5% for 1 year is equal to $100. So what is this? That's 100 over 1.05, which is 95 point something, right? And for the other one, we say, well, some amount is going to grow at 1.05 for 2 years, and it will turn into 100. But what is this amount? It will be x over 100, 100 over 1.05 squared. And that will be somewhere around $99, right? Make sense? Okay. So now, sort of, the next question I might ask you is, well, let's imagine that somebody says, you know what? I'll give you this promise that I will pay you $100 in 1 year, and then I'll pay you another $100 in 2 years. Right? So can we figure out how much we're willing to pay for it if we think that the appropriate trade-off rate of return is 5%? Just roughly speaking, what do you think? Why is that? It's just the sum of the two, right? We don't care if we're getting these from the same guy or from different guys, right? So you promised us 101 year and 102 years. So whether we get them, one of these hundreds from Joe and the other from Bob, or we get both of them from Joe, the guy who's promising it to us, right? It doesn't matter to us, right? As long as we have the estimation of this similar riskiness of both of them, right? So just the value of a stream of cash flows is just the sum of the values of the individual cash flows, right? So these values are basically additive, right? So in general, for a stream of cash flows where we have somehow determined the appropriate next best investment somewhere else, right? We can just find the value of each individual one and add them up, right? So, in general, if we have 100 and 100, it will be the present value of this 100 and the present value of this 100 added together, right? Because if we put that amount somewhere else at that rate, it would grow, and then we'd be able to get $100 here. And if we grow some more, and we'll be able to get our final $100, right? And we wouldn't want to pay any more than that, because then we're not going to be able to, we're going to get the rate of return that is less on our money, right? And why would we do that when we can just go somewhere else? And instead, the next best alternative is going to give us that rate. Right? Does this flow of thinking make sense? Does anybody want any clarification or have any questions about it? You guys over there at the back? Yes.
So the answer to this, we would just add 95 and 90.
Right, well, whatever this happens to be, it'll be 95 point something and 90 point something. So, yeah, I think we can ignore that part, and we're talking roughly speaking, and it'll be 95 plus 90, which happens to be 185. Right, I mean, we can actually check it. Can anyone give me the exact amounts? 90.7. And for the first one? Okay, 95.2. Alright, so it'll be 185.9 or so, right? Alright, so let's see what happens, right? So if we put in exactly 185.9, alright, so we're putting it in, 185.9, and we're saying we are earning 5% in it, right? So let's see, at the end of the first year, how much do we have in our investment? 185.9 times 1.05, right? Because we grow by 5%. Right, so at this point we say, okay, it is time for me to receive my first $100. Right, so you take out the $100 and go spend it on like upgrading your bicycle or something, right? And you say, okay, I'm left with 95.2, and that will continue growing at 5%, right? So now we grow again by 5%, and what do we get? Well, we already know that we're getting back to 95.2%. So that is $100 or so. Plus or minus, you can easily around it, right? So then, okay, time for me to withdraw my second $100 and go splurge on like some sushi, right? So there we go, right? We put in 185.9, and if it indeed grows at 5%, we'll be able to get $100 in year one and another $100 in year two, right? So this is basically the flow of thinking, right? The rate you could given what's a particular rate of return, and it doesn't have to be the same rate in every period, right? In general, if you think if I lend you money for 1 year, maybe I will demand 5%, but if you want me to lend you money for 2 years, I will want 6%, right? And in general, you will see, like, if you look at bank CDs, right? The longer term the CD is, the higher rate of interest they're willing to pay, right? Because, in order for you to be willing to lock up your money for a longer term, you need some extra compensation, right? For now, we're just not really worrying about it, but of course, it could be the same thing, where the first year would be growing by some percentage, the second year would be growing by another rate of returns, and we can accommodate sort of different rates for different periods, no problem. But let's just not worry about it for now. I mean, we want to just give us the idea of how things are working without thinking about too many of these details, right? And as it is, there's already a lot of details. Trying to keep the detail to as to the minimum, but still make sense of things, right? Okay, so this is the general idea, and you can see that we can find the sort of the present value of any stream of cash flows. You can also find the future value of a stream of cash flows, right? So you can imagine that, you can say, well, if I will be putting in $100 at the end of the first year, and putting in another $100 at the end of the second year, and I'm earning, say, 5% or whatever percent on my investment, how much will I have at the end? Well, you can again take each one individually. You'll say, okay, so at the end will say be at the end of year two. So this first 100 is going to grow for 1 year at your rate of interest, right? The second 100, how many years does it have to grow until you start counting the money? Just counting right here, and then year two. Zero, right? We're putting it in and then say, okay, time to count my money, right? So the second 100 doesn't have any time to grow, right? But so if you want to know how much we will have at 5%, well, that'll be 100 growing at 5%, the first one, plus the second 100 that we just put in. And we add them together until that's how much we'll have in our investment at the end of the year. Right, now this is only two, right? We can be looking 10 years out, and we know that the first 100 is put in at the end of year one. How many years will it have to accumulate returns until the end of year 10? 9, that's right. Right? From time 0 to end of year 10, we have 10, but from time 1, right, we comment off by 1 error, so I just wanted to throw out the question. It's going to be 9, the next one is going to be 8, and so on and so forth. Right? And again, we can just add them up and we can estimate how much we'll have in our account, assuming we get that rate of return for the entire period, right? So dealing with multiple cash flows is really no different than dealing with a single cash flow. It's just we deal with single cash flow many times, and then you add things. So nothing really too world-shattering going on, right? Any questions? Anyone have any thoughts about it, or anything you need clarifying, or something? And I always encourage you to ask questions if you have some kind of application that you're thinking of, or anything like that.
So if you say you were going to year 3 or 4 or whatever, would you get the 5% on just the 100 you put in the second year, or would you get it on the 205 that you have in the first?
Well, if you have, if this is an investment that gives you a rate of return on whatever money you have in it, you would be getting the 5% on the whole 105, right? I mean, 205, right? From year 2 to year 3, right? So we have year 3 here, right? So, and we're saying I'm putting what happens is you get your 5%, so now you have 205. You get the 5% of the 205, and you get your, right? So you add your 100, so it would be about 250. Now the thing is, so that's exactly what will happen, but we actually don't have to do this step by step. And we can break this down into pieces. We don't have to add them in the middle. We can choose to add them only at the end. You can say this 100 will go at 5% for 2 years. Alright, so that will turn into 100 times 1.05 squared. Alright, this 100 will grow at 5% for 1 year. That will turn into 100 times 1.05, and this 100 doesn't get to grow at all. And then we add them. Right? So either way, whether we do it your way, where we say take it here, then add them, take it here, or we just look at each individual one as if they were separate, we should produce exactly the same result, right? It's just that this is a little easier to do when you have, say, a bunch of payments, right? And you don't have to say, well, let me do this and add, and do this and add. You can just like do all these and add, right? But it's, it produces exactly the same result. But it's a good way to think about like how things are actually happening. Right? Okay, any other comments? Okay. All right. So as soon as it happens, we actually have. So in a general case, right? If we want. We want to write down, say, the present value of a stream of cash flow, right? That is, that we're starting to receive from the end of the first year out to year 2, for example, right? It would just be, the total present value is going to be the sum of all the individual values, right? It would be the cash flow divided by 1 plus the rate to the number of periods that it occurs, and I goes from 1 to 5. So we're just going to take each one and sum them, and the future value is going to be, the other way, right? Because we're going to be sum of I goes from again to 0 to -1, right? Because remember we don't get the interest on the last one, right? And the number of periods in the first one is actually 1 less than the whole rate, right? And again, that'll be the cash flow times 1 plus R to the I, right? We're going to create each one and then add them up, right? So the row is 1 plus 2. So, just some fancy summation notation for those of you who are familiar with it. Do not don't be worried about it. Just know what it is, right? We're taking each individual one, present or future value, and just summing them together in order to figure out what the value is. Right? Okay. Now, as it happens, if each of the cash flows that we're planning to invest or receive is of the same amount, then this produces a sort of a regular geometric series, and we can actually have a nice closed form expression for the sum of all of them together, right? And this is sort of the idea of the present value of annuity and future value of annuity. Remember, annuity means a regular cash, a regular stream of cash flows of a fixed amount happening at regular intervals, right? So, if we do some fancy or maybe not so fancy mathematics, we can actually find a nice closed form expression for these summations. Right? So in that case, if we're working on like a 30-year mortgage, which is, with monthly payments, how many payments do we have in a 30-year mortgage? All right, 360, right? 12 months per year times 30 years, 360 payments, right? And so, trying to find, work with 360 payments, it can be a giant beta if you do them each individually, unless you happen to have a spreadsheet, in this case, we don't really care, right? And so, there are these nice closed form expressions for the streams of annuities which give regular payment, and it's easy to work with. Now, we might talk about them later, or we might not. At this point, I don't think I'm going to get into it. And they're not really so important anymore because now we have computers that can do all of this stuff for us. So we don't really have to worry about doing 360 payments at this time, right? But when you just one thing, like when you look, when you read the Gitman text, and they'll talk about annuities, right? And they say, well, I don't know if you got the example of annuities yet, maybe that's in chapter 5. Right? Just keep in mind that this is basically what we're talking about. They're talking about speed of payments, regular amounts happening in regular intervals, and there are nice, sort of computationally cheap ways to get them all at once without having to do the actual summation of all the terms, right? Okay, any questions? Are you with me? Okay. All right. Now, before we go on to talk about some other stuff, I want to talk about real versus nominal returns. Is anyone familiar with the terminology at all? Just out of curiosity, we'll talk about it anyway. Anyone? No? All right. So this has to deal with the idea of inflation, right? So let's have an example that demonstrate what's really going on. I recall we talked a little bit about inflation before, right? Like what it is. Yes? No? Maybe? All right, so what is inflation? Anybody would like to volunteer as a rough and tumble meeting? All right. All right, so the value of each dollar, the purchasing power of a dollar, goes down over time, right? Or conversely, prices of things go up over time, right? So that's the definition of inflation. The definition is the rise in prices of a broad basket of goods over time, or a decrease in the value of the goods, right? So we can think of it as follows, right? Let's imagine that today we have $100, right? Here's the time zero. And let's imagine that we can represent sort of a broad basket of goods out there in the economy that people generally want to buy with, say, a pizza. And everybody loves it, right? And so let's imagine that a pizza today costs $10. Right? Again, and obviously pizza will not uniform to everybody. Just for hypothetical case, we're representing sort of the value of the basket, the unit of the basket. Right? So our wealth today at time zero, denominated in dollars, is $100 US, right? And if we have that, we know that pizzas cost $10 per pizza. Right? We can say, well, I want to denominate my wealth in pizzas. Right? So if that is what I want to do, how many pizzas worth of wealth do I have today at time zero? All right, you can all divide 100 by 10, right? That would be so high. 10 pizzas, right? So our wealth is actually 10 pizzas, right? 10 pizzas, which is today equivalent to 100 USD, right? So let's see. Let's imagine that we take our $100 and put it into some kind of an investment that promises to give us 5% rate of return, right? So if that is the case, we invested our $100 at 5%, right? What do we have at time one? Not a trick question, $105, right? So it seems like our wealth has gone up by 5%. Sounds pretty spiffy, I'll buy that, right? But let's imagine that in the meantime, prices of things have increased, or the value of the dollar has increased. So that now the value of a pizza is, say, $10.2. Right? So, if that is the case, Alright, so now our new wealth at time one is $105. What is our new wealth at time one as measured in terms of pizzas? Alright, 10.3 or so. Now 10.3 is our wealth as measured in terms of real goods. In our example, that being pizzas. Right? So, the rate of return we got in our dollars is 5%. But by what percentage did our real wealth increase? Real wealth meaning wealth as measured in terms of the stuff we can get. Right? So what is the percentage increase in our wealth as measured in terms of real goods? 3%. How did we find that? Okay, so our change in real wealth is only 3%. Right, so even though you might say, hey, it looks like I made an investment, my wealth has increased by 5%, it hasn't really, right? Because each of the units denominating your wealth lost value, right? So that sort of canceled out some of the increase in the number of units. And so remember we discussed that inflation is the increase in prices or increase in the value of the dollar. So we could say, what was the rate of inflation over this period? Well, the prices of goods went from $10 to $10.3. So what was the rate of inflation in this period? 2%, right? Right? So, in general, this is the idea that, so this in turn, measured in terms of dollars, the terminology here is called the nominal return, right? The return in name only, right? Measured in terms of dollars. Now, the return in terms of the actual amount of goods you can get with your dollars, measured in terms of pieces, is called the real return, right? Because that is the actual increase in your wealth, in terms of how much stuff you can get, right? And this is called the rate of inflation, right? So this is the relationship between nominal return, the return that we expect to receive in terms of dollars, the rate of inflation, which is the rate at which we expect prices to increase or the value of the dollar to decrease, and the real return, which is how much our real wealth actually increased. Yes?
So if you asked us what the real return would be, what would you tell us? You'd say like 3%?
You would say like 3%, exactly. Right? So, any other questions? Is this making sense? Are you buying what I'm putting down? All right. So let's just so you understand the logic of what's going on, right? Now let's try to convert it into symbolic algebra, because today is symbolic algebra, right? So what happened, right? Our nominal return was measured, we started out that would be 5%, right? So we said, okay, our 1 plus the nominal return is 100, right? So to find the real return, what did we do? We divided it by 1 plus the inflation rate, right? And that produced 1 plus the real return. All right, so this is a precise relationship. You notice that this is actually multiplicative, it's not additive. All right? Now, for small rates, it is actually very well approximated with an additive relationship. Right? We can actually show that to you. All right? In general, if I say that the nominal rate is 10% and the rate of inflation is 3%, you can use this relationship and find what would be the real rate of return, right? Or if I give you the real rate and I give you the rate of inflation, you can use this relationship to find the nominal rate. Basically, given any two, you can find the third one, right? Make sense? So let's let's rearrange this a little bit, right? So we can say that 1 plus the nominal rate is a big R, because in cases of positive inflation, nominal rate is bigger than the real rate. If you want a little mnemonic for remembering which one's which, right? The big R is the nominal rate, right? Then you're going to be 1 plus the real rate and times 1 plus inflation, right? So let's expand the parentheses here. What do we have? We have 1 plus R plus I plus R times I. Right? And we can cancel out the 1 here too. So what this shows us is that the nominal rate is the real rate plus the inflation rate plus I times R. Now as it happens, if inflation rate is relatively small and the real rate is also relatively small, then I times R is really, really small. Right? Think about it, like 0.03 times 0.02 is like 0.0005, right? It's really small. We can basically ignore it and we can say that the nominal rate is approximately equal to the real rate plus inflation rate. Right? Which is why here, we found that the nominal rate is about 2 plus 3 is 5%. It's not exactly that, right? It's a little off, there was some decimal place with the rounding going on. But for small rates, the approximate relationship is a pretty good ballpark estimate, right? If you're walking down the street and somebody says, "All right, quick, tell me what would be my nominal rate if I had 5% real and 2% inflation," you're like, "Okay, about 7%, right?" Because you just add them together. Now, if you happen to be sitting down and you have your calculator in front of you, you can actually calculate what it will be, right? And it will be slightly more than just the sum of them, because there is that tiny extra term that changes the exact value, right? Now, this of course becomes more important as we get into higher real returns and higher inflation rates, right? But as long as they're relatively small, they're basically negligible for practical purposes. Okay? Any questions? Yes.
If you put in the values, it should be like 1 plus 5.
Oh, it should be in decimal, right? 1 was 0.05, right? Good question though, because I'm sure you will not be the only one who made that mistake at some point. So, right, the good thing to clarify, right? These are, the percentage of rates are supposed to be expressed in decimal, right? 5% is 0.05. So, and the rest is the same thing. Right? Because obviously you've got integer percentages there. This is not going to make sense. Okay, any other questions? Okay. So now that we have this idea, right, we could say, all right, now we know that inflation is going to affect what we actually get at the end, right? I mean, we don't care that we have $1 million if a pizza costs $1,000, right? It's just $1 million isn't that much, right? So it's not all about the currency numerator, right? It's not all about how many units of currency that you have. It's about how much stuff you can get, right? So for example, you might say, all right, today, in order for me to basically have enough wealth to be able to support myself and my investment income, I might need, say, $1 million, right? Because that means that if I get about a 10% rate of return, I'll be making about $100,000 minus the taxes, whatever, I can live on that, right? But it's not necessarily the case that you should say, all right, that means that I should aim for $1 million for my total retirement savings. Right? Because by the time you retire, the value of the dollar will have been eroded by inflation, the overall yield. Right? And so maybe $1 million will only be enough to afford a cardboard box next to the building, right? There may be a chamber pot on the side, and you don't want to end up there, right? So you might want to say, okay, in order to get the same the same amount of wealth, the same purchasing power, the same quality of life as I would get today with $1 million worth of wealth, how much would I need in 50 years? Right? Well, for that, you need to figure out, you need to make an assumption of what you think will be approximately the average rate of inflation over those 50 years. Right? So, for example, let's imagine that we're looking at it and we're saying, okay, I guess we can assume like 3% rate of inflation for the long term. Because again, the government currently targets inflation in their number in the range of 2 to 3%. That's their stated objective. To target 2 to 3% rate of inflation. So let's just be generous and say that we expect a 3% average rate of inflation over the next 50 years or so, right? So if that is the case, and we have, let's say we know that at time zero today, $1 million is what we want in today's, in today's prices and the value of today's dollars. How much money would that mean in 50 years? At time 50, assuming that prices grow at a rate of 3% per year for 50 years. So let's see how much more. Does anyone have a number you'd like to throw out?
4.4 million.
4.4 million. Do we have agreements? 4.4, everybody? Okay. How do you get that?
You said 3%, right?
Yeah.
So I believe million times 1.03 to the 50.
All right. All right. So the prices of things grow at 3% per year, right? So in order for us to buy the same amount of things, we have to grow our dollars also at 3% per year, right? So that means the inflation is going to be taking 3% every year for 50 years. To get the equivalent amount, it will be 1 million times 1.03 in the 50 years. All right? So you can see that the magic of compound growth works in our favor when we are earning rates of return, but it works against us when we're talking about rates of inflation. Because remember, inflation rates are also, also compounded. Like you lose 3% of the value today, and you lose another 3% of the previous value again, right? So there's also a multiplicative compound growth, right, in the prices of things, right? So, so $4.4 million in 50 years is about, assuming that the inflation rate is about 3%, is going to be about $1 million today. Right? So essentially, we're talking about more than fourfold increase in prices over the next 50 years, assuming a relatively modest inflation rate of 3% holds up. Right? So that's one thing that we'll need to take into account when we're thinking how much money do I need to have in hand in 50 years in order to have a good base of assets to be able to hang out and relax, right? And not worry about whether my cardboard box is blowing up or Okay? All right. Does anyone have any questions about this idea? Regarding that. Okay. Well, in that case, let me ask you a question. Let's imagine that somebody says, I will give you, $10 million in 50 years. All right, so you want to know how much actual purchasing power will that give me in terms of what I can get today with it, right? So you want to know, how much is that worth in today's dollars? So you say, okay, let me assume a 3% rate of inflation, and I want to find how much is that, and how much is it worth in today's dollars, right? In terms of how much stuff I can buy, how much stuff I will be able to buy in the 50 years with that kind of money. So go ahead and try and find how much $10 million in 50 years is worth in today's dollars. Do we have any results? All right. We have review 2.3, like that. All right, so how did we find that? Well, we know that whatever this amount is, the prices are going to grow at 3% for 50 years, and we're going to produce 2 million, right? So we're going to divide this by 150 to find out what that is. All right? Make sense? Okay. So it happens to be 22 million. Now, no surprise, it's about a factor of 4, 3% years. All right? But so this is the basic idea. You might remember that we had that example when we say, we're going to put in $5,000 every year for 50 years. We're going to get about 10% rate of growth. So how much money do we have at the end of 50 years in our IRA or something? And we had a picture looking like that, right? A nice smooth exponential curve where, the first $5,000 gets to grow for 50 years and it becomes like $580,000 or so. And then the next one gets to grow for 49 and it becomes like another 530, etc., right? And, this is, of course, the contribution of like the first 5,000, right? So like put it in and we start counting out money. And so we said that altogether, this all adds up to about $6.5 million, right, at the end of 50 years. And you were like, hey, $6.5 million, pretty sweet, I'll buy that, all right? But of course, remember that the 10% average annual rate of return on diversified mix of equities is a nominal return, right? It's a return measured in terms of dollars, right? So prices of stocks go up and dividends are paid, all this whole measured in terms of dollars. So now we want to know how much is that $6.5 million worth in terms of actual purchasing power today, right? Because we need to know like what it actually means, right? Obviously, if inflation happens over these 50 years, right, it's going to erode the value of the dollar, right? Just as if you look in the past, for $1 you could like go out and have a hearty meal back in the 1960s, and now for $1 you're lucky to get a McDonald's Happy Meal. Not the whole Happy Meal, it's like one burger, right? So the value of the dollar has eroded over time, and it will continue eroding, assuming there is not some kind of drastic change in economic policy or something like that, right? If we get unlikely to hyperinflation like we had in the 70s, right? In the 70s, we had inflation rates in the 10 to 15% range, and kind of really sucked. And in some countries where they just fail to control what's going on, they just like we expand the money supply, and we get like hundreds of percent of inflation per year. Right? It happened in Zimbabwe, right? You had to cart around, a whole wheelbarrow of money to buy a loaf of bread, right? Because it's just like inflation was like 100% per day. That's like it's like dumping money in the market. And like in Russia in the 90s, again, the same thing happened. Like inflation was like 100% per year. It wasn't quite as bad, nothing was as bad as Zimbabwe. But anyway, right? So that that really erodes the value of your investment assets, right? At least the currency denominated assets, right? If you have just money sitting in the bank, they're going to be paying you some rate of interest. They're not going to, and they'll try to sort of follow inflation and try to convince people not to take money out of the bank. I mean, we'll talk about structure of financial institutions in a little bit, right? But still, like you're going to lose a bunch of value. Whereas if you own actual real assets, right, the prices of assets is going to rise. So inflation doesn't really affect how much wealth you have. Because real goods remain real goods. Maybe an investment in equity markets, since there is actually a claim on the productivity of the real assets of the firm, is better than, say, an investment in debt with a fixed interest rate. Because if you lend somebody $1,000 and promise to pay you 5%, then you're going to keep doing that, right? And in the meantime, if the value of the dollar goes through the floor, it's still going to get the same amount. It's going to work right? So let's just hope that we don't run into hyperinflation in this country because it's not going to be a fun time for anybody. But anyway, so 6.5 million. So let's assume that things keep chugging along with relative stability and have a 3% rate of inflation. What does it mean in terms of today's dollars? Our 6.5 million. In 50 years, right? Well, again, we're going to divide by 1 and 3 to the 50th, just what we did before. So about a factor of 4. So what do we get? Right, so it's not so bad, right? 1.5 million. I could retire on that today, right? We all could probably. So it's fine, right? It's just realize that it's not as awesome as having 6.5 million today, right? Having 6.5 million in 50 years is about the same as 1 million, right? So that's definitely something to watch out for as we as we sort of conduct our plans for the future as far as what we expect to have and what our monetary assets measured in terms of dollars will actually mean in terms of purchasing power, right? Okay. Now, at this point, I wanted to conduct some sort of simulations of asset return and what we get at the end. But before we do that, I need to talk about the normal distribution and the meaning of mean and variance. Right? So, how many of you know what the normal distribution is? Many of you have heard of the normal distribution. Okay. All right. Well, regardless of if you know or have heard of it, or if you didn't, we're going to talk about it anyway. So, after this class, if somebody ever asks you, do you know about the normal distribution? You can say, yes, I do. Unless you forget all of that. Now, before we go on, anybody have any questions about stuff we discussed so far with the rates of return, real, nominal, inflation, present value, future value of money, annuities, and all that other stuff? You can always ask me those questions later if you want, but now is not the time.
You talk practically this presentation.
Now that's, if there are sort of quirks in the tax law as far as investment returns, right? In general, you pay taxes on your nominal return, right? So if you had an asset that's worth 100 and then you sold it for 110, right? For the purposes, from the point of view of the IRS, you made a 10% return. And whether inflation has eroded the value of your dollars or not, they don't care. They say, you bought it for 100, you sold it for 110, so you made $10 of profit. Right, so we're going to tax you on $10 of profit, right? And so, depending on the type of return you made, in general, like the capital gains tax on long-term investment, at this point would be about 15%, which is a lot better than the marginal tax rate on income, if you happen to be like not in the lowest tier of income, right? On the other hand, if you bought it and sold it within 365 days, it doesn't count as a long-term capital gain, it counts as a short-term capital gain, and that's taxed as your regular income, right? So it depends on how long you held it. The other thing is, capital gains do not get taxed until you realize them. So, if you say bought a stock and it paid you $10 in dividends, right? That is taxed as you got the $10 in dividends. And actually, dividends also have a special tax rate, which is about 15% now, but you don't get taxed as your regular income, right? But, here, let's say you bought a stock at 100 and it doesn't pay dividends. Instead, it appreciated to 110, but you haven't sold it yet. No tax, right? The gain hasn't been realized. And then you hold it for another year, maybe it appreciates by another 20%, and it's now worth 130. You haven't sold it yet, there's no tax. Right? Now, if you sell it now and you get $30, and the IRS says you just made a $30 capital gain, we're going to tax it. Right? But so it depends on what we're talking about as far as taxes, as far as what is the investment strategy. Are you buying and selling a lot and realizing gains, or are you holding assets and not realizing gains? Right? They'll have a different impact. And we'll actually, when we talk about IRAs, we'll discuss why it is so attractive to be able to defer taxes for later, right? Or better yet, not pay taxes at all. If you pay them up front and then you go back to the regular. We'll talk about IRAs later. There's a lot of cool things about it. All right, so I haven't included taxes in our discussion of inflation, because it depends on whether you're realizing those gains, right? And again, it depends on their short-term or long-term, what their tax rates are, etc. Right? It's a good question. I'm glad you were thinking about it because, again, as far as realistic planning, you have to think about what's going to be the tax impact of the plan. Right? So we're sort of building the base of all the pieces, and we'll start putting them together as a semester. All right? Anybody else? All right, normal distribution is. Okay, so you might remember how we basically derived from first principles the idea of the binomial distribution, right? And so it was looking, sort of kind of like this, right? We were a discrete distribution and the probability of certain things that might happen, right? We kind of right? And so, the idea was that it is a lot more likely for an outcome to happen somewhere around here than it is for an outcome out here, right? And we discussed how unlikely it is in the case of, say, 100 coin tosses to lose all 100 coin tosses, right? So that would be like, lose all 100, right? We do that much. Now, the normal distribution has a very, very similar probability, but it is a continuous distribution, right? The binomial was discrete, right? Had integer outcomes, right? It is like the count of successes in certain number of products. Now, the normal distribution is a continuous distribution, and so we can say that there is some kind of a random variable that can have different outcomes with different probabilities. Now, the simplest distribution is just the uniform distribution. If you say, pick a number between 0 and 1, and any one is equally likely, right, this is the uniform distribution, right? So the probability of picking this number right here is the same as picking this number right here, right? Now, the normal distribution is not uniform. That means if something, if a normal distribution surrounding the mean value of the outcome is going to look somewhat like the binomial distribution, right? It's going to look kind of like that. And what it says is that if we're generating some kind of a random value with this distribution, it is relatively likely that the value will be somewhere here, right? And it is relatively unlikely that it will end up somewhere here or somewhere here. Right? Now, it is easy to find, the mean of the distribution. The normal distribution is symmetric. So it is symmetric right around here, around the mean. Right? And the mean of any random variable, as we discussed, right? The expected value of the mean is the sum of probability times the outcome, right? So for a normal distribution which is continuous, this would actually convert into an integral of the distribution times the value of that. But I mean, on an intuitive level, like, you don't have to worry about that. On an intuitive level, it's the same, right? It's basically a probability weighted average for what could possibly happen. And these things that are more likely to happen are a lot more going to affect what the mean is a lot more than the unlikely things, right? Kind of the big effect. Okay? Now, normal distribution is like sort of a general shape. It's like the bell curve. You all probably have heard about the bell curve, right? The idea is that it is like a normal distribution. So, I mean, the normal distribution has a number of parameters. Number one is the mean, right? So, for example, if we have normal distribution with a mean of 5, right? This would be the bell curve centered around 5, right? We also have something normally distributed with a mean of 10, right? That would be the distribution centered around 10 itself, right? So, another parameter that describes normal distribution is the variance, and that is how wide the distribution is around the mean. So, for example, if some random variable has a normal distribution that is it's shaped kind of like this, right? Meaning that this is very high, very densely concentrated around the mean. So it is very, very unlikely that you'll be out of here. Alright, so you have pretty high certainty of what the result will be if you make a drawing from a random observation from a normal distributed variable like that. But another variable can have exactly the same mean, but have a much greater dispersion around this mean. Right? And so if you have two random variables, one with a distribution looking like that and one looking like this, you will see that as you draw samples from these two distributions, the ones from this one are going to be clustered all around here, but the ones from the other one, they'll be a lot more around further from the mean. Right? So the reason I talk about sort of a continuous normal distribution is because it's sort of convenient to model possible rates of return in the market as kind of normal distribution. So if you look at historical rates of return, you will see that on average there is some kind of return and there is also some kind of dispersion. Okay? And so next time we'll get into running some simulations and we're going to use this idea of withdrawing random samples from a normally distributed random variable for simulating returns that we can receive from the market.